Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Varon. Part 9. Friendly Delight. To deter unwelcome banter from his two apprentices about his sexuality, Chinn, a lonely migrant worker in Brazil, visits the local brothel. In that brothel, he meets Tiz, a young girl who has been tricked into prostitution and is held captive. The two make friends. I might as well be on another planet, he thought sourly. Loneliness welled up inside him, a bitter, all-enveloping ache, and he longed with all his heart to be back with his family as they ate their evening meal by the light of a flickering oil lamp in the small shack he had called home for so many precious years. Looking out at the anonymous crowd hurrying up and down the street, he realized that the biggest ache in his heart was to be with people he belonged to. His mother, father, his younger brother and two sisters, as well as his frail old grandmother. An invisible cord bound them all together and gave each of them a sense of self that was warm and secure. With sadness, he recognized that he would never be able to go home again, since they depended on the money he sent them, and even then they only just managed to survive.
However, there was yet another thing worrying him that morning. He'd always known he was different, and had finally plucked up the courage to go across the city to a gay bar on the other side of the city on his infrequent days off. He'd tried very hard to hide this from the trainees in the workshop, for he'd heard their conversation about the prostitutes they visited and the girlfriends they took out on festival days. He knew that once they discovered that he preferred men, his life and work would be a misery, and he would be the butt of jokes and constant teasing. Indeed, only yesterday he'd overheard big, clumsy Bruno whispering behind his hand to the newest trainee Luis, and had caught the words queer and poof, followed by a nasty snigger. When they'd seen him watching them, they'd stopped talking and guiltily resumed their work on the bicycle they were repairing together.
They must have guessed. What am I to do? He thought desperately as he gazed unseeing at the passing crowds. At that moment a fat, belligerent-looking man stopped inches away from him, took a packet of cigarettes from his pocket, lit one and, puffing happily, continued on up the street. As Chinn idly watched him, he crossed over and went into a building that advertised itself as the Sparkling Delight Striptease Club. I've seen you before, thought Chinn. So that's where you work. Indeed, in the small shop window, he could just make out a scantily clad girl lounging in a seductive pose intended to entice the passers-by into going inside. Luis had taken great delight in telling Chinn only the day before that, in fact, the place was actually a brothel, not a striptease at all, and he thought wryly that it was a great pity he felt no desire to sample the so-called sparkling delights that were on offer inside. Then an idea suddenly occurred to him. It popped into his head and surprised him so much that he sat blinking, his cup of water forgotten in his hand. Why shouldn't I go and visit the brothel anyway? No one would know why I was really there. I could just chat to a prostitute and leave. Then Louise, Bruno and the other lads would believe that I was just like them. The more he thought about it, the more it appealed to him as a way out of his problems. Taking a large gulp of water and smiling to himself, he went back inside to his bike. That evening, as the trainees were packing up to go home, Chinn casually asked Bruno, "Are the girls any good in the Sparkling Delight, Bruno? You seem to go there a lot, so they can't be too bad." Both Louise and Bruno looked very surprised at the question, but nonetheless they gave Chinn an intimate description of their favourite prostitutes and how much they cost. "You thinking of going then?" inquired Louise, an impudent grin on his cheeky face. "Thought I might go this evening," replied Chinn with an assumed air of nonchalance. "Best of luck," commented Bruno, laboriously winding his arms into what he mistakenly thought was a seductive pose. "You can tell us all about it in the morning, boss." And with that the two made their way out of the door, laughing conspiratorially together.
Chinn went back to his room, washed and changed, with a pounding heart and trembling legs, made his way up the hill to the Sparkling Delight, feeling anything but sparkling. Minutes ticked by as he stood in the shadow of a shop doorway on the opposite side of the road, trying to pluck up the courage to go in. Darkness was falling, and the neon sign above the brothel window was suddenly illuminated as somebody inside switched it on. Chinn, oblivious of the traffic and the hurrying crowds, found himself gazing at a gross representation of a half-naked woman bent into an impossible pose on the sign, outlined in orange and green flashing lights. For a while he stood mesmerised and repelled by the grotesque, pulsing female body, but eventually he realised that he either had to enter and face whatever was inside, or go home. Giving himself a good shake, he crossed the street, pushed open the door, and was confronted by the fat man he'd seen earlier in the day, who appeared to be the doorman. He was sitting on a chair just inside the entrance, but ignored Chinn, who walked nervously past him into a waiting area. There he found himself facing a repulsive, reptilian old woman, seated behind a small desk, who silently held out a bony hand for his money.
"Good thing Bruno told me how much these girls cost," Chinn thought to himself, thrusting some notes into the waiting claw.
"Choose who you want," commanded the crone in a hard, brittle voice, pointing to a row of girls sitting on two couches at the other side of the hall. Chinn turned to look at them. His mouth went dry, and he broke out in a sweat as he gazed in horror at the four girls, listlessly regarding him across the waiting area. They were of different ages and dressed in a variety of loose wraps, but in his panic-stricken state they all looked the same. 1,000 fearful thoughts chased each other through his head.
"Why have I come? How do I know which one to choose? What shall I do?" Suddenly he noticed that one of the wraps was covered in a pattern of butterflies, and thinking of the butterflies at home, he pointed at the girl who was wearing it and said in a strangled voice, "I'll have that one." When the butterfly girl rose from the couch, he could see that she was small and slender. As she walked in front of him across the hallway to the room, with head bent and shoulders hunched, even Chinn, in his agitated state, sensed her weary dejection. Without glancing at him, she lay down on the bed and clenched her fists, every muscle in her body taut and quivering. The wrap had fallen open as she climbed onto the bed, and revealed to Chinn's startled gaze a figure that was almost childlike in its proportions. Gazing helplessly down at the vulnerable form on the bed, he suddenly realized the girl was more frightened than he was. Wonderingly, he put out a hand to touch her, but she shrank back, eyes staring, nostrils flared as a patient, conscious on the operating table, shrinks from the surgeon's approaching blade. Mystified, he sat down beside her on a chair and said softly, "Don't worry. I don't want to touch you. Can't we just talk? What's your name?"
The girl looked at him in astonishment and said in a surprised voice, "Little Flower, but my real name is Tiz."
"Where do you come from, Tiz?" asked Chinn gently. Tiz told him the name of her village, and then in a puzzled voice inquired,
"Why don't you want to have sex with me?" Chinn gazed at her, desperately searching in his mind for words that this girl might understand. At last he blurted out,
"I prefer men to women." There was a silence that seemed to Chinn to go on endlessly, and he looked down at his feet in embarrassment, wishing with all his heart that he was somewhere else.
"But why have you come here to me then?" she eventually inquired, when she'd grasped the logic of what he had said.
"It's because," he replied, "if I don't pretend to be like most other men, the boys at my work will make my life hell." A sudden thought then struck him, and he hastily added, "Please don't tell anyone what happened in here tonight, will you?"
"No, of course I won't," said Tiz softly. "You're in trouble like me, aren't you?" She sat up on the bed and, fastening her wrap tightly round her, regarded him for the first time. Chinn, short and stocky with spiky black hair and untidy clothes, looked back at her nervously. "Please stay a long time," she pleaded impulsively. "Then I won't have to go back to work so soon." Chinn was surprised. He'd intended to get out of the room as quickly as possible, but this pathetic request suddenly revived an early memory of a time at home when one of his little sisters was lying ill with a fever. He could still hear her voice pleading with him not to leave her. In an odd way, the prostitute on the bed reminded him of that incident, and he felt a strong desire to protect this terrified girl welling up in his heart. He looked at her again, deep into her eyes this time, and saw there an expression of intense wistfulness and despair. Rarely had he seen such naked suffering mirrored in a human face.
"Tell me about yourself, then," he said at last. So Tiz poured out the story of her life at home and the reason for her arrival at the Sparkling Delight brothel. As she talked about her mother, father, and little brother, Chinn sensed a depth of misery and longing that matched his own. Suddenly there was a sharp knock, and the door opened slightly.
"Are you going to pay for another session?" rasped the turtle's voice. Hastily, Chinn jumped to his feet, knocking the chair over in his anxiety.
"I'm just coming," he said through the crack. Turning back to Tiz, he muttered hurriedly, "I'll be back to see you again, little flower." Then he pulled open the door, scurried gratefully across the hall, and escaped out into the street. Chinn slept badly that night, and in consequence arrived slightly late at the workshop. Usually he got there first in order to prepare the list of tasks for the day. But on opening the street door he saw that both Bruno and Louis had already arrived and were pretending to be very busy cleaning two bikes that had just been repaired. When they saw him they both grinned, and Louis inquired salaciously, "Had a good night, boss? Who did you have then?" And he leered at Bruno, a knowing expression on his face. Recognizing that this was a test question, a sense of relief swept over Chinn as he realized that he knew Tiz's working name. "Little Flower," he replied with an assumed nonchalance. "Oh, her," sneered Louis. "I only have her if all the other girls have gone. She's not much good. They must have been having a busy night. You should try another one next time." "That's a good idea," replied Chinn, privately resolving to have Tiz each time he went. To his great surprise, he realized indeed that he actually wanted to go back and talk to the strange little flower, which drooped so sadly in the garden of Sparkling Delight. The following week Chinn visited the brothel again, making sure that he let Bruno and Louis know where he was going. On his way he bought a bag of sweets from the stall near the bike shop, and with these in his pocket entered the hallway and paid his money to the intimidating woman at the desk. Looking her full in the face, he announced confidently, "I want Little Flower."
There were only 2 prostitutes sitting on the couch, and after a quick glance she said harshly, "Little Flower is busy. Take another. They're both good."
"No, thank you. I'll wait," replied Chinn firmly, sitting down on a wooden chair next to the desk. 5 minutes later, the door to one of the side rooms opened, and to his surprise out lumbered Bruno, followed by Tiz, who stumbled across to the couch and sat down looking both hopeless and depressed. "Hello, boss," he said to Chinn, stopping at the desk. "Don't have her. She's rubbish." And with a dismissive laugh he sauntered out. Chinn breathed a big sigh of relief, saying quickly, "I'll take Little Flower now." Getting up, he went hastily across to Tiz and, slipping his arm round her waist, helped her into the vacant room. They sat down side by side on the bed. Fumbling in his pocket, he retrieved the sweets and held them out to her. "Here," he said gently, "I've brought these for you."
Wonderingly, Tiz took the packet. "No one's ever done that for me before," she whispered, looking at the multicoloured sweets, and a tiny smile illuminated her face like a small ray of winter sunshine brightening a dark room. Opening the bag, she held it out for him to take one. "Please tell me about yourself," she asked. "You heard about me, but who are you?" So Chinn described his mother and father, younger brother and sisters, and his old grandmother who lived with them.
He also spoke of his intense homesickness. "I'd give anything to be back home," he said sadly. "In a way, I wish I was stupid. But you see, I was clever at school, so they sent me to do a course in bike repair. Then I came here to Belize, so I could send money back to keep my family. We're very poor." Tiz nodded sympathetically.
"We are too," she said. "That's why I'm here." And an involuntary shudder shook her slight frame, and her eyes filled with tears.
"Every day I think about each person in my family and what they might be doing," Chinn added glumly. "But I wonder sometimes whether I shall ever see them again." And he ran his hands through his hair, making it stand up on end like a bristly black brush.
"Me too," said Tiz dejectedly. "I want to know if Davy is still alive." And she buried her face in her hands and groaned.
"We both want the same things, don't we?" said Chinn wonderingly. "Look, I'll come and see you as often as I can, Tiz, so we can talk together. Perhaps that will make us feel a bit better." With that he began to tell her about the workshop and the trainees, the room where he lodged and the people who lived and worked near the shop. "If it hadn't been for Bruno and Louis," he said finally, "I wouldn't be here. They're not bad lads, just young and silly," he added, smiling. Tiz listened intently to what he told her, realizing for the first time since she had come to the brothel that there was a life outside its walls.
"Please come again soon," she begged as he got up to go.
"I will, Tiz," he replied, looking at the forlorn figure still sitting on the bed. As he walked down the hill back to his room, Chinn began to plan his next visit. "I can talk to her," he said to himself. "I don't have to be careful what I say." And his heart felt lighter at the thought.
So began an odd friendship that benefited both of them. They spent many sessions curled up on the bed together in friendly talk, often sharing sweets, but also sharing a deepening companionship. 2 forlorn, sad souls reaching out to each other for mutual support.
"You're happy these days," remarked Louis to Chinn one morning as he caught his boss whistling while he cleaned some small cogs. "Oh, am I?" replied Chinn, surprised. "I suppose it's because I've been working so hard I've got a rise." You should try it sometime, he added, looking sternly at the young man. But that's not the only reason, he said to himself. It's because of Tiz that I've been working harder. I'm not so lonely any more. Oh, yes, he added under his breath as he turned away. It's also because you think I'm like you. And he smiled a satisfied, secret smile.
Not long after her first encounter with Chinn, as Tiz and Yara were cuddled up together on the top bunk, she told her friend about him. I like him, Yara, she said wistfully. He's as sad as I am, but please don't say anything to the others, because I promised not to tell a soul. Oh, but now I've told you, she added miserably. It's great news, Tiz. I'm amazed that one of those awful men could actually be kind. I won't say a word to anyone. Don't worry, promised Yara. I had a feeling you were just a tiny bit happier. Perhaps this is where our luck is going to turn, she added, and I'll find a way for us to escape. Oh, Yara, let it be soon, let it be soon, whispered Tiz in a desperate voice. I shall die if I stay here much longer.
The April rain spat viciously against the bedroom window and roused Kirsty from a deep sleep. Drowsily she stretched out her hand for her alarm clock. But as her fingers groped in the half-light, its bell began to shrill.
Oh no, she groaned, glancing towards the window and registering the fact that it was raining. Not 6 o'clock already, and wet. Today of all days. A thought slowly sat up in her brain, stretched, and announced in a small, satisfied voice, Yes, but today's the day. I'm going to be a nurse at last. Real hospital, real patients, real everything. A tingle of excitement ran through her body, and she smiled to herself as she stretched the night out of her limbs. Then a procession of worries sent the excitement right away. They marched through her mind like a long line of monsters, each more scary than the last. Shall I like it, I wonder? I've been planning for this day for so long, but what if I'm no good? What if I make a stupid mistake? And, worst monster of all, what if I miss some obvious symptom and someone dies? That will be dreadful. These and a succession of related anxieties all clamoured for instant attention as she lay in bed staring at the rain making rivulets down the window pane. Don't be so silly, said her sensible self at last. Just get up, put on your uniform, have breakfast and go.
3/4 of an hour later, washed, dressed and breakfasted, Kirsty hurried down the road to the hospital, still fretting distractedly about the coming day. At the entrance she met a fellow student nurse, also going to her first ward placement.
Hi there, Nadia, said Kirsty as they fell into step. How do you feel? It's scary, isn't it? All that theory and a couple of outside placements don't seem to have done much to calm my nerves. Me too, replied Nadia. I just hope I don't kill somebody. What if my hand shakes so much I can't give an injection? What ward are you on? Inquired Kirsty as they hurried to the lift. Men's surgical, replied her colleague, grimacing. Poor old you, sympathised Kirsty. That's a tough one to start on. I'm on gynae.
They reached the lift and waited with a group of other nurses for its arrival. Most of these were second or third years who stood in silence, too sleepy to talk much. Nervously, Kirsty checked the names against the list of floor buttons, although she already knew that her ward was on the 4th floor. Up went the lift, and as the doors opened and closed, the butterflies in her stomach flew in closer and closer formation. All too quickly the 4th floor came. The doors opened for the final time, and she found herself walking quickly down the corridor to her ward. By now, all the worries were forgotten, and the feeling of excited anticipation had taken their place. The day passed in a constant bustle of things to do. Kirsty was immediately immersed in helping her patients with their activities of daily living, such as eating, drinking, checking skin integrity, and the constant round of observations of blood pressure, temperature, and pulse. As she was being given her list, she noticed that the sister looked at her closely.
Why is she watching me like that? She wondered. Does she think I'm about to make a mess of things? Well, I'm not going to, she added fiercely. When I do my report, it's going to be perfect. All the care plans will be immaculate, and there will be no crossings out on the charts. So she squared her shoulders and set off to find her first patient, who was a young woman about her own age. I'm Kirsty, she said, smiling down at her. I'm your nurse, and I'm here to look after you. The woman looked tired and worried, gazed up at her, a small answering smile hovering round her lips for a second. Hello, she said in a weary voice. Not more temperature taking. All went well for Kirsty until the last detail was entered on the chart. What if I filled it in incorrectly? She suddenly thought in panic, fishing it out of its holder again to check that the name and the information she'd just written down were right. Perhaps I should do it all again, just to make sure, said a fearful voice in her head, but she resisted it firmly and returned the chart to its place, trying to look as if this was the correct thing to do. This will all be easier when I get used to it, she said to herself as she glanced abstractedly at the young woman in the bed, who was lying back on her pillows, eyes closed. Suddenly into her head came a vivid picture of her mother, who had died of cancer in her last year at school. I wish you could see me now, Mum. You'd be so proud of me, she thought sadly, turning her head away so that the patient shouldn't see her eyes filling with tears.
When she sat down at last to eat her lunch in the hospital restaurant, Kirsty realised she was very tired. Her feet ached, and her mind bulged with all the new information she had to remember.
That was a hard morning's work, she said to herself, but I enjoyed it. What a relief! And she drank the last of her coffee, feeling happier than she had all day.
On the Thursday of her final week on the ward, Kirsty was working on the high dependency unit next to the sister's office. In the first bed was a young woman who'd already had 3 miscarriages and had been rushed in the night before with a threatened fourth. She lay quietly in bed and, to Kirsty's surprise, was amazingly calm.
She couldn't be calmer if she were in a hotel room waiting for room service, she thought as she took her temperature. I'm sure I shouldn't be so relaxed if I were in her position. On the bedside locker was a picture of a handsome, dark-haired man. Is that your partner? She inquired. Yes, replied the woman, smiling. Have you been together long? Asked Kirsty, trying to put her at ease. 4 years, came the reply. 4 happy years, and the woman seemed to glow with an inner radiance.
You have been listening to Tis from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, safe place only you can hide, trusting the nose to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere You're